Tough gospel today. Tough. Anybody think they're licentious? Ooh, kind of an old word. Slander. Anybody use the word folly? That's not an academic term, or even in certain things. A little harsh, Jesus, a little harsh. But if we forget that what Jesus is talking about isn't necessarily just this piece about what is evil, but we think about what it makes evil, we start to see something different. Jesus is arguing very harshly against the sign of the letter of the law. In a world where we want to be perfect, in a world that tells us we need to be perfect, Jesus tells us, well, you aren't, even if you think you're being perfect. Even if you keep every law. And I know some of you probably speed just as much as I do. That was not why I had a car crash. But ultimately, sometimes we break those laws. Sometimes for good reasons. Sometimes the laws of the land are not necessarily the laws of our hearts. You might want to pay your taxes, though. The thing is that when we come down to the laws that God has given us, we can go on and on and on about how many statutes and ordinances. We even read from Deuteronomy today. The first giving of the law in Torah was not enough, so they made a second one. Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law. Josiah, the king, ordered that all the laws be gathered into one so that he could have a just reign. And that is how Josiah, king of Israel, is remembered, as a just king, as one that fixated on the law of God and the laws that kept the people, and God's people especially, to be the way that God had intended them to be. We Lutherans don't like the law too much. It becomes oh no, I never did enough. And sometimes that Catholic guilt becomes a little bit of Lutheran shame, just a little bit. You bring it down just a notch. When we look at laws that command us, and we look at the idea that God is going to tell us what to do, and that if we break that, we might think we never have another chance. Once something is broken, how can it be repaired? The book of James gives us a clue. And he uses a strange word for us to think about. How many of you would say you're religious? No? What you doing here? Those that say that they are religious, it hits us a little softer. But what if you said, I have religion? Anybody say that? Probably not. It's an archaic phrase. To say I have religion is a way of saying someone else does not. To saying I am religious doesn't necessarily mean that. So the archaic way of saying I have religion says that it's like a little pat on your shoulders, saying that something about you is better than others. I have God. Others don't. And I don't think anybody in this building says that. But that is the fact of what Jesus is arguing about in our gospel for today when he calls the Pharisees hypocrites. He's looking at the fact that they can say the law and say, we have God because we do all of these things. We wash ourselves according to what God has said in the Torah, in Tanakh. There's nothing wrong with that, except when it tells other people that if they are not doing everything right, that God is not with them. Religion is a word that gets tossed around, and people say what? They say, I have spirituality, right? Spirituality is good, it's nice, it's open-minded. But to be religious, that's another thing. That harkens down, it bridles everything, it controls everything. Something that keeps you from not being entirely yourself or entirely free. So is it any wonder then that we get verses from James here? But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act. They will be blessed in their doing. Not long after this, James says the famous quote that Luther hated, which is, "Faith without works is dead." Cool to have religion. Cool to have faith. Great. But what do you do with it? If something lies on your heart and you have a value and you do something that doesn't go with your values, what happens? Guilt. Crud. I didn't do what I thought I needed to do. What else? There's another word that starts with S. It's not sin. Shame. That bites a little more, doesn't it? Shame is a condition of believing that we are not right. Not that I did something wrong. Guilt is a little safer. You can work with that. Shame, on the other hand, tells you that something is wrong with you because of something you did. Indeed, the way that we understand the taking of the law, especially in Pharisaic corners, was a little more debated. We need to give a little more room, I think, to the Pharisees. They're trying to do the right thing. But the problem is that if we start to believe that if what we do is the right thing, that someone else does the wrong thing, the question becomes not so much about who is right and wrong, but how we bridge that gap. Religio means to ligament, as you can understand. Anybody have ligaments? Right? Ligaments are connections. They're ties, they're sinews. There's all these words that tell us that our bones and our muscles are connected. Ligament is a word that we use almost every day. But when we talk about religion, it takes on a different understanding. We think religion apart from that. But if we get back down to the base of the word, religio really means reconnect. God reconnects with us. The story of the gospel, the story of the law that has come all the way across to the end of our books and even beyond in the living word that lives among us and through us and in us. It ties us not only together, but it ties us to the God that comes down and says, "I have not left you." The thing that you screwed up on, the thing that you messed up on, the thing that wasn't perfect is not going to keep me from you. It's religion. It's the thing that keeps us tied together in the connection with God. Harsh gospel today. Harsh in the sense that if we are not doers of what goes into our hearts, we are, what's the H word that he uses here? Hypocrites. How many of you in the last few decades have heard that Christians are hypocrites? Sometimes we are. It's okay. But that's just it. We were never meant to be perfect in a world of sin. God was not expecting us, if you go with me, out of the garden. God was not expecting us to be absolutely perfect. If we were supposed to be like God, but not be God, we could never be as perfect as the one that gives us perfection. Just like this art form of sealing in cracks with gold, the idea that the gaps between us and the gaps between even in ourselves, the things of our heart and the things that we say and do, if there is a disconnect there, God connects it with gold. The idea being that gold does not rust. Gold does not change shape unless you hit it. Don't hit it. Gold is somehow miraculous in the fact that it never changes. It always remains. So is it any wonder that so many churches are so filled with gold? Because it is the idea that this is a perfect example of a perfect world. The idea that gold never changes, just as God never changes. Unfortunately, that has been co-opted over time. Gold becomes aligned with money. Gold becomes aligned with wealth. And wealth becomes aligned with perfection. It's a disconnect from a material in this world that doesn't define who we are. Over time, gold becomes the thing of kings. Only kings have things in gold. Only the church has gold. Only important people. Only powerful people. Only people who have somehow got it right, that they are so blessed by God that God is with them and they have a lot of gold. Yeah, it is funny. It's ironic. For something that never changes, it's dead. We are not in a state of death. We are in a state of life. Faith without works is dead, meaning the same thing if we think about the same idea, that if gold doesn't change, if we don't change, then how exactly are we any better in God's sight? The point in everything that we do in faith, the point of grace is not to be perfect. It is not to be golden. It's to be flesh and blood, full of connections to ourselves and sometimes missed connections with each other and even with our own hearts. So it's a strange thing when Jesus says heart here, that it's from the human heart that all these evil things come from. Because ultimately, when Jesus is talking about this, we have to say, though, what was different in the idea that God has put a law on our hearts in the book of Jeremiah. It's very confusing. The human heart, though, that is not touched by God, and I don't know a single one that isn't touched by God, does bring about a lot of these things. It's true that what we take in this world cannot harm us. So the idea, even when James says that you don't want to be stained by it. We confuse baptism to be this washing away of everything that we are to make us absolutely perfect. But that's in God's sight, not as we are in this world. To God, God looks down on us and sees the Son alive in us. The point that we are golden is not the fact that we are not meant to change, but that God, who is there to change us, is making us more beautiful in the life that we have together. Faith without works is dead, is the sense that faith in us is not something that we assent to or just think in complicity, just observe. But then by doing and by living, God is working through us. The word we use in psychology when our heart doesn't match our action is called cognitive dissonance. Have you heard of this before? Dissonance in music comes together and it creates interesting things. Can you give me a second? Now resolve it, please. A little nicer. Thank you. That dissonance keeps us on our toes, it keeps us edging, but it also hopes for a change, some resolution, that we can come to some place where we can feel a little at peace, a little perfection. But the thing is that this cognitive dissonance is exactly what keeps us being perfected. To try to reconnect the mind and the heart, to try to connect the hands to what the power of God is in us is something that ultimately perfects us. Not by any measure of our work, but because God's work in us, God's work for us, makes us beautiful. Life is not just tragedy after tragedy, even though the news might have us believe that. It's not just heartache and pain, it's not just suffering. There are, within all these cracks, hope, deliverance, relief, commiseration even. The sense that in connecting together and seeing those cracks filled in is where those gaps become golden. The things that do not change in this world, it's not us. We definitely change. But the ways we are connected by God and the way that we are connected never, ever changes. We're entering into a time of discernment in faith formation. Churches are always at a place when they're observing themselves and they're doing some of the internal work to figure out, what are we becoming? But the thing about faith in this way is that we have to trust that what comes to us is something that isn't going to come from any one person, but how we're all hearing the Spirit together and the movement of the life together that God is urging us on to do. It's fine and dandy, it's true, if you can sit and listen to a sermon. But if it goes nowhere, what was the point? And you don't have to listen to me, you can do what you want. But the point being, of course, is that where God meets us in these connections is how we understand our ways of discerning the Spirit. How we relate to one another, those things that do not change, and even when they are broken, the ways we fill them up again with something beautiful. That is the life itself that we are called to live in searching the Spirit, in searching the heart. One last thing. When Jesus talks about the heart, he's not talking about this. Even in Latin, the idea of being from the heart is from the pectoral, not from the heart itself. That is something new. The heart, however, is here. And what is here? Sorry? Your gut. But that also has a positive implication now, right? This is the stomach as well, right? Gut is the stomach. What happens in the stomach? Digestion. What happens when something doesn't agree with you in your stomach? Indigestion. There you go. Awesome. Good way of saying it. The point being that if something disagrees with us, right? That somehow it doesn't fit where we are, and yet we get a little bit of pain from that. Or we have to find some kind of way of relieving that indigestion. But just like digestion in general, the stomach breaks things down so that they can be used elsewhere. Do not hear this, that God breaks us down. Instead, God builds us up from the ways that the world causes us to break, from the ways that we ourselves are broken, from the things that we leave as gaps without anything to be filled. But we can discern that God's Spirit is the thing that puts the gold between all those cracks, making them perfect, unchangeable. And if this relationship is perfect, the connection we have this way will also be. Life is beautiful. Amen.